Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So today on the channel, I want to talk about a document which has been circulating the preposphere lately, and that's this minister's order from the province of Saskatchewan. Happens to be the province I live in. Is this just overhyped BS that people are chalking up to martial law and freaking out about? Is there any legitimacy to that? Or is this really something to be concerned about? If you're a skeptic and you have pie in the sky ideals of how great the future is going to be and you don't think history is going to repeat, we got something in this video for you. If you're a doomer who needs a constant fatalist fix of bad news in order to make it through your day, don't worry, we got a lot of bad news in this video for you as well. But I want to kind of shed a little bit of light on this document because the video that is going viral that's talking about this particular document, it started off great. It started off doing an honest assessment of this and scrutinizing this document, which deserves to be scrutinized for reasons that we're going to get into. But then they start talking about channeling spirits and talking to crystal balls, literally.
Around October 26th, that was another date that Spirit showed me is not good. It's
that Spirit showed me.
To me, that equates to taking a big old dump of misinformation into something which deserves some attention. And unfortunately, when you do that, okay, when you present something like this in a critical light, and then when you go and mix it in with whatever the space alien equivalent is, then it doesn't reflect good on people who in the future are going to bring these things to the attention. Because then they're going to say, oh yeah, you're talking about those people who were channeling spirits and all the rest. If you believe in that stuff, fine. I'm just saying, let's try to separate these topics so we don't come off as complete quacks. So one of the biggest concerns I've had throughout the entirety of this past 20 months is the obvious government missteps along the way. In many cases, it's equated to a lot of overreach in some respects. For some people, they still think it's underreach, which I just can't comprehend how they could perceive it that way, but whatever. What I will say is that what concerns me most now is that if we were to enter a true crisis, disaster, post-apocalyptic type situation, the biggest thing you are going to have to contend with, if it hasn't become abundantly clear right now, is going to be the powers that be. Because, let's face it, you've seen those zombie movies. Is it the zombies that ultimately are the biggest issue you have to contend with? No, it's always the other humans. And documents like this scare the living bejesus out of me if they were ever fully executed. The question is this document for real? Yes, it's real. Is it going to be fully realized in the not so distant future? I don't think so. But if we were to see a crisis which was an order of magnitude greater than the one that we're seeing right now, let's say we've seen a pandemic that had 10 times the lethality rate. Could you imagine what the response would be? If the response that we're seeing to this crisis has been the way it is, imagine what they'd be willing to do in an actual wartime situation, in a real war situation. So I'm not concerned about immediate martial law being implemented in Saskatchewan and Canada, but I'm not going to rule it out, but it's an incremental thing. And the reason why I'm not worried about that, I will get into more detail about it, but there is a certain range of what's going to be accepted within any given community. And no matter what is written in a document like this, if the population is not there yet in terms of their ability to accept it, it will never fly. And something like this fully executed right now just simply would never fly. There would be nobody to enforce it because I know people who work in law enforcement and they would never follow through with something like this. Most of them would turn in their badges long before that happened, unless there was a legitimate, fully fledged crisis. Now that we've already been primed to accept a lot of things, okay? Now that the precedent has already been set with the past 2 years with this pandemic that we're in, the next major disaster, people are going to relinquish control much, much easier. So let's just dive into this. Let's break this down. Now, the first thing that's going to strike you is this thing is 1 page long. This is something which basically eradicates, in theory anyways, almost every charter right and freedom of the Canadians in the province of question, and it's 1 page long. There are video game apps who have terms of service which are 100 pages long, And this thing is so open-ended and vague, subject to interpretation, that one page. So what you need to know about this declaration of health emergency, this was already implemented of March 2020. Then I believe it was shelved for a while when the pandemic got under control. Now they're bringing it back because cases are peaking once again. So we didn't go into full-fledged military dictatorship in the past year, which is why I'm not worried about it being taken to the outer limits this time. But again, this does have drastic implications for the future, not only of our province, but around the entire world. So this is called the Emergency Planning Act. And what this does is it affords the health minister of our province and the premier and the government essentially as a whole to empower themselves with more sweeping powers, which are going to effectively nullify a lot of people's charter rights and freedoms, if it ever came down to it. So let's read this royal decree handed down by Her Majesty's forthright henchman, the Lieutenant Governor General of the Province of Saskatchewan. On the making of an emergency declaration or a renewal of an emergency declaration, which is what this is, and during the emergency period, the minister may put into operation any emergency plan or program that the minister considers appropriate. Okay, did you hear that? Any emergency plan or program that the minister considers appropriate. So right there, you could have basically ended this document, but they decided to elaborate in a little bit more depth anyways, how you will potentially be screwed over if we enter a World War III type scenario. Acquire or utilize any real or personal property that the minister considers necessary to prevent, combat, or alleviate the effects of an emergency. Now, there are no appendices, there are no asterisks. There is nothing saying here that people will be compensated if they have things confiscated for the purpose of serving this greater emergency plan. It just says acquire or utilize any real or personal property that the minister considers necessary to prevent, combat, or alleviate the effects of an emergency. I know there's a lot of people out there, probably particularly down south in the States, laughing at Canadians and Australians right now. But just remember, your country drafted people into war, I believe 6 times throughout history. And really, in the past 50 years, it's happened. To me, that is one of the greatest infringements of rights, that level of conscription, especially if it's to fight a proxy war where you don't really know what you're fighting for, what the outcome is going to be, and there's just a lot of shady stuff around it. If there was another nation actually invading our nation, you wouldn't even need to make a draft. Most people would volunteer for that. But what I'm trying to say is that it's very likely that your state or your federal government has something very similar to this that they can execute in times of emergency. So just don't get too complacent down there. Authorize any qualified person to render aid of the type that a person is qualified to provide. So our military trucks need fixing so that we can bring fuel or create blockades or whatever the case might be. Well, you're going to have to leave your job and your family and you're going to have to come and help us. Now, I should say, because I know some people are going to start freaking out and they're not going to watch the video to the end, there's a big caveat to this. I do not believe that this is going to be exercised to the fullest. They can only implement this to a reasonable extent. And this is the reason why. The Charters of Rights and Freedoms, the Charter, which is kind of like our Constitution, but not as good as what you guys have down there, meanwhile, requires governments to impose only reasonable limits on Canadians' constitutional rights and allows legislatures to enact laws beyond those limits only in limited circumstances for limited periods. So a judge could easily look at the actions of a province that was executing something like this. If they were not executing it fairly, then there could be legal repercussions. So in the heat of crisis, yes, this is something that they theoretically could implement, but not without potential legal recourse. So let's just carry on here. Control or prohibit travel from any area of Saskatchewan. Now, they have done that interprovincially between some provinces. I'm not sure if they've actually done it within this province of Saskatchewan. Provide for the restoration of essential facilities and the distribution of essential supplies. To me, that makes sense. That's a perfectly reasonable level of power that you would want to confide in government in a time of crisis. For the most part, provide, maintain, and coordinate emergency medical, welfare, law enforcement, and other essential services in any part of Saskatchewan. You like how they just sandwich that one in there. Provide, maintain, and coordinate emergency medical, welfare, law enforcement, and other essential services in any part of Saskatchewan. They wouldn't want to lead with law enforcement because that would seem way too tyrannical. And law enforcement is probably under the umbrella of emergency services anyways. Cause the evacuation of persons and the removal of persons or livestock and personal property from any area of Saskatchewan that is or may be affected by an emergency, and make arrangements for the adequate care and protection of those persons, to livestock, and of personal property. What this really is talking about, let's say there's a forest fire and they want to force people to evacuate an area. We have had to deal with this one many times throughout the last few years. Now, this is the sketchy one that got everybody's attention. Authorize the entry into any building or on any land without warrant by any person in the course of implementing an emergency plan. And I guess when you pair this one with D, acquire and utilize any real or personal property, basically means that any old Tom, Dick, and Harry with a deputy badge can come into your home, help themselves out to milk and cookies, whatever else they choose that they deem necessary for emergency purposes. Again, this is a one-page long document. I don't know if this is blown up in greater detail somewhere, but looking at this, it's no wonder why this is scaring the living bejesus out of a lot of people. Cause the demolition or removal of any trees, structures, or crops if the demolition or removal is necessary and appropriate in order to reach the scene of an emergency, to attempt to forestall its occurrence, or to combat its progress. Again, that makes perfect sense. If we're talking about a wildfire situation, they need to do a prescribed burn, or if there's a tornado or power lines down or whatever the case might be, they need to move something. That makes perfect sense to me. That's understandable. Procure or fix prices for food, clothing, fuel, equipment, medical supplies, or any other essential supplies in the use of property, services, resources, and equipment within any part of Saskatchewan during the emergency period. To me, that makes sense because that's going to prevent people from doing any sort of price gouging, so long they themselves, and by they I mean the dealers, aren't being price gouged by the distributors who are selling the stuff to them. So long as they can still make a fair and honest profit off of what they're doing, then I guess that's justifiable in the context of an emergency. Cause information to be collected, used, or disclosed that the minister is satisfied is necessary to prevent, combat, and alleviate the effects of an emergency, and for no other purpose. So they throw us one little tiny bone at the end of all this there when they say you can have any information that you want about anybody or any given thing. You can go into their house, you can take their milk and cookies, whatever you want, but for no other purpose, okay? For no other purpose aside the purpose of dealing with the crisis. So very vague, open-ended, ambiguous. One of the last ones here is conscript persons needed to meet an emergency. So they use the word conscript, which is basically like a draft. Maybe not a military draft, but they're going to draft people who they deem to be essential workers, which they've already kind of done in some ways with their battle with the unions. The last one here, do all acts and take all proceedings that are reasonably necessary to meet the emergency. So I need to drive home the point for all the skeptics out there, because I know I'm going to get a lot of flack from people saying, oh, you're fanning the hysteria. You know, we're not in the middle of the cis mass extinction. What are you talking about? There's nothing to worry about. There's no reason to prep for this stuff at all. Just go and turn in your guns and frolic and play on the trending page to your heart's content. I don't think we're in imminent danger of martial law. But what this means essentially is that if we had a disaster which was just slightly bigger than the one we've just experienced, then we should expect that the authorities will leverage the powers imbued in them by a document like this to the fullest extent possible. And when I say possible, what I mean is this. What you need to understand is that the authorities, okay, by that I mean the enforcers, the police, the military, people like that, they're not just going to start enforcing these crazy ideas immediately, especially if they're not reasonable. Here's what I'm concerned about in the not so distant future. People have become incredibly polarized over this whole thing and the intervention which is going on. People are foaming at the mouth, okay? People are mad about it. And what I foresee happening at some point, like we've kind of seen in Australia recently, is that there's going to be a flashpoint. There could potentially be some standoff, some major confrontation, which is going to further polarize the two camps of the enforcers and the people. Because when it comes down to it, the police, the emergency services, we're all on the same side, man. We're all just part of the tax-paying peasantry. And we need to keep that in mind. But what you need to kind of have happen in order to really take something to the outer limits like this and get people to do things like they did in that Stanley Milgram experiment, where people are willing to essentially take lethal action against their fellow man if they were under the gun of authority. If you want people to behave in a fascistic kind of way like that, what you have to do is you have to create an us versus them environment. Let's say, for instance, you're one of the thousands of amazing police officers out there who want nothing more but to make society a better place. Let's say you're one of those guys, okay? You go into work one day, they say, hey, put on this riot shield. People are protesting about some shit down the street. They don't want to comply with some royal decree from the Queen. So you go and you put the boots on. You're like, all right, you know, I probably kind of understand what they're saying, but I got to put these boots on anyways. You get the gear on. You walk out there with your buddies in the middle of the street. The first thing that happens, what the hell was that? I just got hit with a huge rock that some young punk across the street threw at me. Now you start to think those people are bad. Okay, what they represent must be bad also. You go out there and you try to neutralize the threat. Okay, now those people start to think to themselves, see, this is just proof that these guys are just the henchmen of the elites. And it goes back and forth till you have these two sides hating one another. That's when they could finesse something like this into the population. Do I think that our premier is sitting there wanting to do this? No, because a lot of people don't know this, but Saskatchewan and Alberta, we're typically the last holdouts for stuff like this. If there was ever a province in Canada which harbored people who could even be considered remotely close to what you would call a libertarian, it would be Saskatchewan and Alberta. So we've resisted a lot of this kind of thing for a long time. So no, I don't want John Gormley, our local news talk radio guy, to be coming on the radio tomorrow and saying, oh, look, Canadian Prepper is promoting conspiracies about the Premier exacting martial law on the population. I hope I've made it abundantly clear that's not what I'm saying, but I do think this is a blueprint for what could come to pass if things got a lot worse. And it just adds another dimension of complexity for us preppers to have to deal with in times of crisis. It's not just about the zombies. It's about the bad guys. And the government, theoretically, is supposed to be the good guy. They're supposed to be the ones who come in and restore law and order. But we all know about the noble lie. We all know that we will be told whatever we need to be told in order to maintain the peace, irrespective of whether or not it is true. Lord Fauci and the Surgeon General made that abundantly clear last year when they explicitly stated and advised people not to wear any facial protection. Now they're hauling kids off airplanes who are 2 years old if they're not wearing facial protection. So we know that they're not going to tell us the truth. Why? For the greater good, for the noble lie. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Canadian Prepper out.